How we do this, we are the truest. Got these fangs super sharp, your shit toothless. Cold-hearted, yeah we ruthless. All the ghouls in the cut, let's get ghoulish. In the graveyard, acting foolish. Finna dance with the devil to no music. Cold-hearted, yeah we ruthless. All the ghouls in the cut, let's get ghoulish.
Hello, ghouls, and welcome to a new episode of the Ghoulish Podcast with me, Max Booth, an undead host. On today's episode, I'm giving you yet again another live episode from the Ghoulish Book Fest that occurred in San Antonio at the end of April, the beginning of May, so just over a month ago now. This panel is discussing the intersection of crime and the horror genre. Jessica Leonard was the moderator, and it had Laurel Hightower, Cynthia Pelayo, Johnny Compton, and John C. Foster on the actual panel. Talking crime, talking spooky stuff, talking spooky crime even. I know this comes to a shock to many of you, but I am not lying. This is no prank. We're talking about two genres together as one, merging to create something new. I guess you have to just listen to the episode. I don't have anything else to say, I guess. Go to ghoulishbooks.com. Buy some books that we have been publishing. Exciting stuff coming up. Mostly been kind of hunkled down in the house, doing some good work, editing books, writing books, reading books, all types of things related to books. If you go over to the Ghoulish Discord, I will have a link in the show notes. We are going to be announcing a Ghoulish Book Club soon. So if you want to read a book with us on the Ghoulish Discord and then talk about it together, I would recommend joining that and checking it for updates. That is going to be fun. Anything else to discuss? I don't think so. So, okay then. This is the episode. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for downloading. Thank you for being a ghoul. Enjoy.
No, we're not the panel. We're here now. We're doing this. I've been told I have to lean into the mic, though, so I'm not going to touch it, but I am going to lean towards it. So, my name is Jessica Leonard, and we are here for the crime and horror panel. Sorry. We're doing great. It's been a long day. It's been long, but we're very happy to be here. So I want to at first, let everybody introduce themselves. Let's start down here, and we'll move down.
Second time I've been the first person to introduce myself.
Do you want to swap?
No, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
I think I'm used to it by now. It's just funny because I'm definitely the rookie, I'm sure, of the panel.
Yeah.
My name is Johnny Compton. I've got a book coming out next year called The Spite House. I've written some short stories as well that have been published in various publications. And I'm just thrilled to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking about this really interesting subject that's always fascinated me, this convergence of crime and horror.
I'm John Foster. I'm from Brooklyn, and I write crime, I write horror, and when I write horror, I have a tendency to put a lot of noir and crime in it because it's fun and it's interesting language to play with. And several of my books have been published by Perpetual Motion Machine and Ghoulish, so they're downstairs at the Ghoulish table. And the newest one, Leech, which came out this week, really blends a lot of noir in with sort of horror and sci-fi horror, so it's a lot of fun.
I'm Laurel Hightower. I am also a horror author, but my debut novel, Whispers in the Dark, was very crime horror sort of blended. I'm a big fan of crime fiction as well, and my latest book is Below. It's a Mothman story, and it came out through Ghoulish, so it is also downstairs for purchase.
I'm Cynthia Pelayo. I write horror, crime, and poetry, and I tend to weave crime into all of my fiction or poetry. I wrote Children of Chicago, which is a procedural horror, and then Into the Forest and all the way through, which is a true crime. And then I have another poetry collection called Crime Scene out this year. That's just narrative in verse, but it's a crime story.
Okay, so just to get us started, there's the thing is, so a square is always a rectangle, but a rectangle is not always a square. So crime is not always horror, but horror is not always crime. But are crimes always horror? I guess that's what I'm getting at for these. Anybody who wants to start. I don't want to pick favorites.
Not necessarily. Like if you think of like a heist novel, it probably wouldn't necessarily be horror, like inducing fear, like heist or something along those lines. Or yeah.
Okay. I agree with that. And I guess depending on how far it gets down into it, but some of like the drug type, like I'm not talking about like mafia or like kingpin sort of thing with murders involved, but some of like the like the growing marijuana and things like that they make documentaries about. I guess I don't find that inherently frightening, but
like Breaking Bad, would you consider that's crime, right? That wouldn't be horror.
That's crime,
right?
yeah. And I guess you could argue that there are horrific elements to it, but it would be hard to classify that as horror, I think, as an overall.
Yeah, I think there's plenty of crime that wouldn't cross over into horror, but then if you look at a movie like a drug movie, I think drugs are a great connective
Me too.
point between.
I like drugs.
Yeah, drugs are awesome.
They are.
It's a very pro-drug panel. But if you look at a movie like Requiem for a Dream, that gets very horrific, and that deals with a lot of drug abuse and stuff like that. So I think that is a bridge between the two, an easy bridge between the two. But if the Postman Always Rings Twice is not horrific. But then there are, of course, crossovers where a book like Psycho begins as a crime story and then goes right into horror.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And it's a heist.
Sort of.
No, yeah, I agree with everybody else. There's a lot of potential for overlap, especially if you're dealing with crimes that involve any kind of life or death situation, obviously. If it's, the clever heists, the kind of behind the scenes Ocean's 11, high concept, nobody's going to get hurt heist, nothing horrific about that. If it's killing Zoe and the heist goes bad and now they're taking hostages and somebody's gone psychotic and they're starting to just kill random hostages, there's definitely aspects of that are horrifying. And I think horror in general is always a matter of perspective, where depending on whose perspective you're writing from, whose POV you're seeing, something can or can't be potentially horrific. So there's also that.
So what are the keys that are making a crime into a horror then? What's something that you look at and you say, okay, this is a crime, but it's horrifying to me? What's a horror?
What do we do here?
What are we doing?
What is horror? This turned into an entirely
We're getting
different panel.
very meta right now, very
Has anyone else seen
existential.
Toy Story though? Because right now I'm feeling very much like Forky. What is cheese?
I think it was already said that if the crime is inducing fear, then I think that we're on our way to horror. But if you're talking like the Richard Stark novels about Parker, which are essentially heist novels, and basically every story is he puts together a crew. There's a heist, someone double crosses and fucks him over, and then he kills a lot of people and gets his money back. But they're not scary.
Right.
But you could turn those things around and make them frightening. If a character took the money and then hid out and then went back and lived in a suburban family and all that stuff, and now think sort of like if Parker was more like the bad guy and Cape Fear and stalking them and terrorizing, and that starts to cross from crime into horror because the character's trying to induce fear in the protagonist.
I wonder how much of it too, honestly, like, because it is so hard to pin down. Because you also really don't want to gatekeep horror. That's one of the big things that gets very frustrating is when someone says this isn't horror, and to someone else it definitely is. Like Rhonda does not like rabbits. So, and that is legit. I'm terrified of watching people do yoga. So for me,
Really?
yes, it's horrifying. I'm always afraid they're going to break their backs. They're twisting in inappropriate ways.
I'm happy I know that, so I don't like post any yoga pictures of myself online.
Just do it. Just let me know ahead of
I
time.
didn't know
and it won't-
that. But I understand the contortion. It could be like
I think it's because,
uncanny.
I think it's because I'm older and very brittle.
You're gonna break your hip.
Yes, I mean, I hurt myself doing things like falling down a step. So, I mean, and again, I think perspective maybe is some of it. Maybe some of the crime we don't find horrific because we have a harder time picturing ourselves in that scenario. A heist might be an example of that. You can see yourself and you can be fearful of being a victim of a murder, of a home invasion, of something like that. But you know, you're probably not going to join Brad Pitt in trying to rip off a casino.
We're not.
And if you do, you're okay with it.
I would though.
Yeah, well, yeah.
If it's on the table.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but you're not going to be horrified by it. So it is.
Fair.
I mean, some of it I think is a matter of whether we can place ourselves in those perspectives, you know, and how we would feel if we were.
Does anybody have anything to add on that? That was very fun. So
We done? Oh,
We're actually.
That's it.
This was all I had planned out. So, do we think that we're just laying a base right now? Are there certain crimes that are always horror? Is a serial killer always horror? Or are there instances where that's a straight crime? And is it just perspective? Is it just your opinion, man, on whether it's that or the other?
I think it would depend on how they're killing people. Do you know, there are different ways of killing. Like John Wayne Gacy dressing up as a clown and killing people is inherently fucking scary. But you know, if someone was like putting cyanide and Tylenol tablets or something like that, it's not. I mean, it's scary, but it's not horror scary. They're just sort of killing people. You know, Silence of the Lambs, serial killer, is scary as shit, and that's easily arguable as horror. But I think it has a lot to do with it, and your perspective. If you're, you know, being stalked, you know, and
So it needs to be personal, is what it sounds. Because if it's removed from you, or like Tylenol, where it's something out there, but if it's something that you could put yourself into,
Well, I think too. I'm sorry.
No.
I do think that when you said that, the first thing I thought was like, oh, you know, cyanide. Anybody poisoning somebody is typically thought of as, you know, that there are a lot of serial killers who have existed like that, but they're not typically thought of, I think, in the horror facet. However, I still think you could, depending on the perspective, again, even if it was focused on the killer, you could write a psychological horror story about that, like The Killer Inside Me. Even if that was not him committing brutal, violent crimes, just poisoning people, if you were getting into that killer's mind while they're thinking about, I'm going to poison this person, these are my motives, and this is all the, you know, the whatever torment or twisted, you know, not judgment free, but I think it's safe to, I mean, if you're poisoning people, I'm not going to take back the twisted adjective.
Judge them.
I'm going to judge it a little bit.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you're examining those things in the story, I still think that there's opportunity at least for horror. It's just that some stuff is obviously going to lean into it more readily, even if you're not trying to. If you're writing about a serial killer who's going around stabbing people all the time, you'd have to really try hard to not make it horror. It would be impressive if you didn't make that at least somewhat horrific. The poison one, you might have to work a little harder, but there's an opportunity there at least.
So this is something that just occurred to me too, because I've been thinking about, you know, like how like you said, like you might have to work hard for it not to be horror. So Helter Skelter. I think Charles Manson and the entire setup is a horrific story, but the fashion in which the prosecutor wrote Helter Skelter was significantly more investigative to me. Now, if someone tells me I was horrified by that, it's horror, I'm absolutely not going to tell them that it's not. But to me, that perspective of, and I wonder how much of it is that too, like, is horror the part in which we see the crime occur, and is crime the part at which the investigation takes over, or that becomes a central piece? I don't know if that's a necessity for it or not, but yeah, I mean, writing it from like, and I work for a lawyer, so I can say this, so writing it from the lawyer's perspective takes the horror right the hell out of it. It's just, it becomes very procedural and, writing motions and shit,
So then, in your own writing, I'm supposed to lean in your own writing, how do you make it horror? If you start with an idea, are you starting with a crime? Are you starting with a horror? Do you know that you're going to be combining both? And what sort of aspects do you pull into that to achieve both?
Well, with Children of Chicago, I wanted it to be a crime mystery, and so the main elements that I knew I needed somebody in law enforcement, and I needed that police procedural aspect. And you can still make it a crime and horror, and if you don't want to write about law enforcement, you can write an amateur sleuth, an amateur detective. So I knew I personally wanted law enforcement because I wanted that Chicago law enforcement perspective. I wanted someone really on the scene of the crime. And so that was the main element that I wanted to determine it as a crime novel, and I wanted to open the novel with a crime. And typically with crime novels, you want to go through and solve the crime at the end, like with the mystery novel, but I wanted to still kind of leave things ambiguous. So that was important for me, to have someone in law enforcement, to open with the crime, and then to move through the investigative elements, and to have resolution, or in my case, not in my book.
John, I'd be interested to hear, because you meld.
Yeah, it's interesting because what Cynthia's talking about and sort of the mystery element, but a lot of crime stories really are just dealing with people who are criminals. They're sort of the scumbags and the alley dwellers of the world. And you can introduce almost any story then, but you're dealing with people whose life is crime, so it's a crime story, so there may not be a mystery. So you could take someone like that and then introduce horror, you can introduce the supernatural, and you just got a natural blend. In some ways too, just like with horror, there are all kinds of tropes. There are styles of writing associated with crime and noir, Chandler and Hammett and all that sort of stuff. So you can bring that kind of vibe to a horror story. But I wrote one story that's in my collection, which is also downstairs for sale, but called Burial Suit. And it's about a guy whose father died, and he is going to bury his father, but he's also going to get revenge. And it just starts out, he has some problems, our protagonist. And we don't realize that it's horror until we've discovered that he's gone to this town, he knows a town, and he knows the name of the person who's responsible for his father's death. But he doesn't know anything more than that, so he's just finding everyone in town named, Charlie Smith and murdering them. And it becomes horror when one point, he goes into the bathroom in his shitty Motel 6 and he dumps some ice from the ice machine in the bathtub because there are 5 severed heads in the bathtub. And we realize he's been decapitating these people all through town, and he's just a psychopath, and he's our protagonist. But it's also very much a crime story because it turns out that he finally finds the real guy, who's a low-level mobster, and takes him out. So it just interweaves. But the heads in the tub was definitely horror.
Heads in a tub is a pretty safe bet for horror.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention quickly the supernatural aspect, because it doesn't, you don't have to introduce the supernatural to make it crime and horror. You can think about Seven. It's just crime. It's just a crime. And then Nightmare Alley, which it feels supernatural, but nothing supernatural ever really happens. But that's another crime. And you could look at it in comparison with The Outsider, Stephen King's Outsider, where you do have like the police procedural and investigation, and then you have that supernatural element. So that's what's cool too. You can kind of, if you didn't want to do the supernatural, and you can still make it horror.
Yeah, and so like, and that's why I'm not even sure that I can answer the question as to whether I've done that, because I feel like, you know, they say like, well, what makes crime horror? And I'm like, throw some ghosts in it. And that's just like, I mean, that's kind of my go-to, you know, things. But I feel like it's like, at that point, you're not even trying to just be crime. Like, you're definitely, you know, you throw the ghosts in, you definitely want it to be horror to an extent. So.
But they're criminal ghosts.
Yeah, they're jerks.
But I think, yeah, actually one thing, and I mentioned this earlier, nexus point between a lot of crime, particularly noir, and a lot of horror, particularly when you get into like Lovecraftian, weird fiction and stuff like that, are protagonists that make bad decisions. And they make decisions to do things, and it propels them on a destructive path, and it's their fault. You know, it's like, you know, I'm deciding to murder my wealthy wife to get her insurance, and even though I'm the hero of the story, I've made a decision that's going to set off the dominoes. A very funny scene in the horror version of that in Cabin in the Woods is when they're all down in the basement, and it's like, you know, don't read the Latin, don't blow the, you know, the conch, and they really have some fun with it. But in Lovecraft, you know, you're always digging into mysteries you shouldn't dig into, or going into tombs to find the catacombs beneath, and just don't fucking go into the catacombs. But they go, and inevitably they're dead or they're mad. You know.
Yeah.
But that's a nexus point, and that's why I think the two also go together so well, because you've got flawed characters quite often.
Yeah, I can agree. So, bad decisions, but also oftentimes mistakes in there. Just like the smallest mistake can turn your whatever life into a horror that you weren't expecting. And I think oftentimes the crime is the expected part in there. You're expecting to have this crime, and then the horror becomes a little unexpected from those moments.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, a lot of crime fiction that focuses on criminals, you know, novels, you know, you mentioned the Parker novels. A lot of those, like you said, it's a mistake or it's something unforeseen. It's a small thing. And then from even their perspective, even though it's maybe not horror, things are going so bad, and it just always feels like, man, this can't get worse. And then it does get worse. We've hit the bottom. Nope, it's like there's actually a deeper level you can go to. And I think that marries to horror very well as well, because a lot of the time in horror, things getting worse, at least for me, that's one of the fascinating things I find in a lot of horror fiction, where you start off and you think, okay, Michael Myers is the serial killer. Also, turns out he might be unkillable. Also, you just shot him out of a window and he just fell to the grass. It's over. Last shot is, actually, no, he's still alive, and he could be anywhere. And so I feel like that is kind of, there's the marriage there too, you know, piggyback on what John said, where you and what you said, where you have that element of whether it's a mistake, whether it's a deliberate bad decision, whatever it is, whether it's underestimating the situation, things just keep getting worse. And I feel like that appears in a lot of crime fiction, and it marries well with horror fiction, because for whatever reason, things just keep getting worse.
If I can just grab what he just said too, back to, you know, it depends on how, you know, a serial killer is doing something. Michael Myers just walks relentlessly towards you, and you've got that John Carpenter, you know, bass heavy, dun, dun, dun. And it's scary as fuck, because he never runs, and he's got a scary, ugly white mask. And there's one scene, you know, like in the hallway where Jamie Lee Curtis is saying there's no such thing as a boogeyman. The kid starts screaming, you turn around, and at first all you see is a white face, because it's just his mask in the dark. That's scary as shit. And that's clearly horror. And they use the same thing, and this is flat out horror, but the same kind of thing is used in It Follows, where the thing just walks towards you, and it's always walking towards you, and you will never get away. And that's terrifying.
Yeah.
Well, but from a crime perspective, not exactly a scene like that, but it called to mind the old movie Wait Until Dark, I think it is,
yeah.
Where, you know, she's blind and she's in the house. To me, that has a lot of, and that's basically kind of a heist style movie, but a more violent, we'll do whatever it takes to kill you if we need to get this, what we need to get heist. And it has a lot of that in the dark, don't know what's going on. Somebody who basically is effectively a boogeyman stalker type is kind of, at the end of the movie, it's between her and him as to whether or not she's going to survive. definitely a crime story, but there's a reason why that makes oftentimes, the scene at the end when she's trying to navigate that and she's blind in the house. Oftentimes that makes lists of scariest all time, AFI scariest all time, that sort of thing, and it's a crime, but again, it's the perspective and it's just the specifics of the circumstance and how you present it. To your point, that can make it scary as hell.
Yeah, a different director with like a different score and some different camera angles, and that you just flip a switch, and that's flat out horror.
And that sort of makes me wonder if the division isn't in part the intention of the writer. Whether their intention is to because one of the most horrifying things that I've seen in the last few years is The Keepers on Netflix, which is a true crime.
Oh my God, yeah.
And I mean, my God, there's no supernatural element to that, but that was horrifying. It's relentless and terrifying because it's an entire system. It's an entire the law enforcement, the church, everything in there was completely. There was no escape. There was no safety. There was no anything for anybody. And in a way, it's still going on. And to me, it's like I would not classify it as horror. I would not say, let's put this in the horror section. It's very clearly true crime. Thriller if you want to go that far, but it's absolutely horrifying, and you do still have those same elements of just the inexorable, you're fucked. And because I think in slashers too, that's one of those things. It's like where you think, the false sense of safety. You finally get to the house where someone else is, and then a knife protrudes from your neighbor's gut, and you realize they're fucked too. And that I feel like I don't think there's been a miniseries that's pissed me off more than that one either. Like every episode, I'm like, those sons of bitches, fuck this! Like I'm so mad about it. But it still was just like it's deeply horrific. So I don't know if it's an intention of the writer how far that falls into it.
And that is a wild one. And I think two things. One, when we're talking about Halloween, I do think that Halloween is actually a story about Dr. Loomis being completely insane and there's no Michael Myers. And I urge you to watch it with that perspective later today and come back to me. But two, I think a lot of what we're really talking about here is atmosphere. Like you're building that tension, that atmosphere of horror around something that maybe might not be horrific. Maybe it's something that's not outwardly horrific, but the atmosphere that you have written into that, the isolation perhaps, or the mistakes that you're putting in there, or just the air around you, the John Carpenter's done it, that is what brings it into horror a lot of the time.
I agree. I think the atmosphere, like you said, the intent, one of what Laurel said, sometimes I think you can get there accidentally, or not even necessarily accidentally, but just everything's in the eye of the beholder, right? But I think that some things are just to a certain degree inherently. I know the movies that presaged my fascination with the idea that crime is horrific oftentimes. When I was a kid, my parents took me to see RoboCop. I was not prepared for that. So watching Boddicker, who to me is one of the scariest villains of all time, torture Murphy, and he's using guns, which is not a traditional horror villain weapon, but it's him and his gang. They've got him isolated. I remember my gut dropping out from me in the theater. It's already a pretty violent movie to that point. I think the Ed 209 had killed that guy in the conference room, and I was like, what the hell am I watching? And my parents were like, sorry, thought this was gonna be like a superhero movie or something. Back when we didn't have all the warnings on the labels and stuff.
You have 20 seconds to comply.
Oh my God. When that happened, he's like, he drops the gun and he's 15.
That was scary.
That was scary as hell to me, because he's dropped the gun, he's facing this giant machine, and it didn't realize that, no, you dropped the gun, so now it's malfunctioning, he's gonna get killed. It took me years to realize that scene's supposed to be played for laughs, like the over-the-top violence. Oh, he gets shot 100 times, so it's funny. If he only got shot 10 times, that's what Paul Verhoeven was thinking. He's a psychopath. But anyway. But then, like, when Murphy gets isolated from his partner, and now he's just surrounded by the criminals, Boddicker goes into his speech about, I don't like cops, and you realize they're gonna not just kill this guy, they're gonna torture him. And I remember, like, this sinking feeling in my stomach as a kid, being like, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm watching something that, like, this, I shouldn't be witnessing this. And it was in that moment, I'd seen other, more blatantly, portrayed as horror movies. But that was like literally the most frightened I'd been in a theater was seeing Boddicker about to kill Murphy and knowing that this is going to be really unpleasant to watch and that this guy's taking pleasure in it and like all these things. And it's just in that facet, it's just a human criminal doing something that's perfectly plausible and realistic. And it just brought to mind for me like the idea that, somebody can be a criminal, just a regular criminal, not a slasher, not Freddy Krueger, not Michael Myers, not Jason Voorhees. You could just be a Clarence Boddicker and still be the most terrifying person I've ever seen in my life.
And that's what's amazing about horror, that it can create that physiological response, right? It can create the dread, the anxiety, and almost like what Laurel was describing with the Keepers, that's terror, because you're just being assaulted episode after episode with like more awful things. And then you also get the whole disgust aspect too in horror, that you can have that as well. But I think when you marry that with like crime, like Johnny said, then you realize, wow, this is just a regular person. It's not Freddy Krueger. That's terrifying. That's scary.
Okay. But did you have something?
No, I just said I agree. We're good.
Agreed. So, do we have any questions from our audience that we want to ask first? Thank you. It's been very helpful. Okay, so I did want to say, let's have everybody go through and give them a recommendation, like a book. It could be a movie. I don't care. Whatever pops to your head. I didn't give you this in advance. Of something that you think perfectly blends that horror and crime together. What would you, if somebody said, I've never heard of this, this is what you should go see, this is what you should go read?
I mean,
no.
Oh, I'm sorry, Cynthia. Well, because I'm sure mine. I wanted to say mine because it's probably something that somebody else is going to say.
Get there first.
Because it's not something you've probably never heard of, or everybody's heard of Silence of the Lambs. I think Red Dragon is scarier. For me, I think the Tooth Fairy is a scarier killer. Hannibal Lecter is scary, but he's almost not damaged enough. And Red Dragon, I'd already read Silence. I'd read Hannibal even before I was like, I'm gonna go back and read Red Dragon. I'm prepared for this. I'm a grown man, be fine. Red Dragon disturbed the hell out of me. So if you're more familiar with Silence of the Lambs and you've read that and maybe already read Hannibal, and you've seen all the movies and associated TV shows, but maybe you've been like, Red Dragon, I would go read Red Dragon. It's got the crime element, the investigative element, but the horror in that to me was just really ripped my guts out.
Sad.
Oh yes, it's devastating.
Real sad.
Yeah.
I'm gonna cheat and do two, because and I'm not just saying this because you're on the panel, John, but like Mr. White, I think is a fantastic blend of crime and horror, and because it definitely, you start out with like you've got spy elements, you've got it definitely seems to be crime, and it seems to be going to hell very quickly, but you have something that is like inexorable and frightening and summoned by the sound of, oh shit, I said it, didn't I?
We're all
I'm
fucked.
screwed. Yeah, we're all fucked. I said it.
Yep.
And then the other one I like to recommend is a movie called Lucky, which was, it stars Brea Grant, and she wrote it. It's directed by Natasha Kermani. And this kind of goes back to the whole perspective issue of it. It is a horror movie. It is also, in a lot of ways, a crime movie, and it's a weird movie. And one of the things I run into a lot is there's a lot of divisiveness over whether people consider it horror because they say, well, it's not scary. I will say, and this is not meant to, throw everybody in categories, but I have found that men tend to find a harder time connecting with it as scary until you say, okay, but if you can suspend reality to see an alien invasion and find it frightening, suspend reality for a moment and realize that is how half the population lives. That's our lives. That is every fucking day. And if that's not frightening, I don't know what the hell is.
So in no way is that we can also still agree to disagree. You may just not like the movie. This is not one of those, if you don't like this movie, you can't be friends with me and also you're sexist. That's not it. But I think, you know, in the same way that if you want to go watch Halloween, in the terms of Loomis is a nutcase, watch Lucky with the sense of, this is, what if this was your life? That it never ends, you cannot trust anybody, you can't help each other, and if you do, you know. So it's just one I like to highly recommend. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Some people like these books or hate them, but I do enjoy them. Lauren Bucas's Shining Girls, The Shining Girls, I think that one marries all of them. You get an amateur detective, you also get the law enforcement, then you get like a supernatural element, and it's such a weird book, and of course it takes place in Chicago, so I'm gonna love it because of that. But I really liked The Shining Girls, and then Broken Monsters, which then she takes what she did, and The Shining Girls goes nuts, and Detroit. So I like those two books a lot when you want to look at crime and horror and how you could really just bend and shake up the genre.
I didn't go yet.
Okay, good, please go.
So just really fast, a funny side note about Mr. White. So the whole thing is you don't say his name because it can hear you. So the tagline was "Don't say his name," which is not good for marketing. When the title of the book is the thing you're not supposed to say, which was just, we discovered that after the covers were printed, and it was like, wow, shit. So Stephen King's The Dark Half. I think is a great book, and it gets overlooked a lot. And it was my introduction to the Parker novels by Richard Stark, because it was in fact inspired in large part by Richard Stark, which was a pseudonym of Donald Westlake, a very famous crime writer. And in the story, the pseudonym of our main character, Thad Beaumont, essentially comes to life and wants to take over and become the person. And this pseudonym, George Stark, was known for writing novels about a character named Alexis Machine, who is essentially Parker. So it's a really good one. I think everyone knows Gillian Flynn from Gone Girl and stuff like that, but her novel Dark Places introduces satanic panic and stuff like that. And I think that atmosphere that comes in takes it from really dark thriller, which is her wheelhouse, her fucking brilliant wheelhouse, and really adds a frightening element to it, because satanic panic is stupid, but it's also when it's really dark and you say Satan, it's kind of scary. And then the last one, Tom Picarielli, who sadly passed several years ago, but he wrote great straightforward crime novels, and also horror novels, and also really trippy fantasy shit. But something like A Choir of Ill Children is great because it has kind of a sort of a southern fried criminal type character, but also like swamp magic and stuff like that. And it's really inbred families and shit. And it's a really great blend.
So, getting into a little different area of it. So we've established that crime and horror definitely go together very well. So if you are a writer and you're like, well, I'm going to do these two genres, perfect, everything's fine, my life is good. But is there, from like a marketing way, is there any sort of genre, like can you write a comedy book and then your next book be a very horrific book and still all be fine? This is a little bit of craft thing. No.
You're yes and no. I think you have to be able to write what you want to write, but you have to understand that not all of your audiences for one area that you write will necessarily love the other area that you write, and that's okay.
Yeah. Because
you're still expanding your reach, but people might be surprised, like, oh my gosh, I wrote this comedy book and then I wrote a romance, and it's like your readers sometimes will feel betrayed because they are expecting,
like you've alienated them.
And so I think of who I really enjoy who does this very well is Daniel Krauss. He writes like a range, like he writes kids books, he writes huge books like The Living Dead with George Romero, and he did like Troll Hunter, the adaptation of Shape of Water, and all his like YA horror. So he's done a lot of different things, and he keeps it successful. But you're always going to kind of be, especially if you're reaching out of the genre completely, reaching out of horror, it might be a little tricky. So just be prepared.
I have definitely heard I've been listening to Bleeding Page podcast, which is Chad Lutsky and Jason Brandt. And if you are looking at like marketing, particularly in any self-publishing sense, but also just generally marketing, it's an incredibly useful, very insightful podcast. They talk to a lot of very successful self-published authors, and one of them was talking about that he did that. He branched out and did like I don't know if it was a romance. It didn't seem like it was like really far out from his wheelhouse, but he meant to do a pen name that he didn't want to keep up with it from like an Amazon page standpoint and all this, and he said it just tanked because people were, the people who were following his name and his craft read that and were like, oh fuck this, we don't want it. And then in the meantime, he also talked about how it gets recommended within the algorithms, right? Because if it's the same author, then, and let's say you write a romance and then it's getting recommended next to all these truly horrific, horror novels, then it's like people aren't going to see that recommendation necessarily. It's not going to be marketed appropriately. So I would feel like that's one of those things that you would probably want a pen name for and just a totally separate marketing plan. And then later you can sort of pop up and be like, haha, just kidding, it was me all along,
Once you're very famous.
Yes, yeah. You rip the mask off.
Do we agree? Do we disagree?
No, yeah, I agree. I think, back to crime and horror. Both crime and horror are kind of big tents, and they cover lots of stuff. But there's a Venn diagram in the middle where you get a lot of crossover fans with certain types of crime and certain types of horror matched together pretty well. So it's, I think, for transferring from genre to genre, that's not a terribly difficult one. But as was said already, Cynthia, if you're writing some, bloody ass horror, and then you write comedy, onto the big top, you're probably not going to get a great crossover audience unless you're Joe Lansdale, who can just write anything. And Jack Ketchum was another guy that could just kind of write anything. But at that point, you're picking it up because it just says Joe Lansdale, and I don't care what the story is. I just know I'm going to have a great time reading this incredible story.
Yeah. And even with that, a lot of the time, I think that with Ketchum and Lansdale, legends, you can also find bridges, right, between when, and so you can kind of, I think, again, I'm the rookie here, but I know that for what I'm hopefully planning, if I get there, by my fourth book, I'd like to write something that's more crime than horror, which is what my game plan is. The first one's a haunted house story. Next one's more straight up horror. Next one's a little bit more of the bridge kind of story where it's blatantly supernatural horror but incorporates some criminal investigative elements and some detective fiction. And then by the fourth one, if it goes well, then by the fourth one, it's a crime story with some horror trappings around it, where the horror is still there, but the horror is more the dressing and the crime is the focus. And so from that perspective, what I'm trying to plan out, and I have no idea if this is going to be successful, so I'm not giving this.
It's going to be successful.
Well,
We're going to be successful.
I have a bad habit of not speaking things into existence positively. I'm very much still waiting for the bottom to drop out of all of this stuff that's happened in my life. In the past, I've had some literal same day of something that I thought was good news, and then it's like, hey, actually this is not happening. So I keep waiting for that to happen. Literally before my read earlier today, because it was last minute, and I was thinking, Max might come in and be like, hey, maybe we have to bump you, and I'll be like, happens.
I have to bump you.
Have to bump you for whatever reason. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows? But I do plan for that. I think that if you can plan out maybe a bridge, and some of that comes down to, do you have the right ideas? Ideally you don't want to have to, work in that professional space, so sometimes you got to write things from that professional mindset of, got to do what I got to do. But hopefully you have the right ideas for it. You don't have to force it. Mine, I have these ideas kind of laid out already, and it's just kind of organic, and I am hoping to transition to that, and by book 4 be able to write this crime story that's been in my head, and just be able to have the supernatural, or the, not even supernatural really, but the horror elements dancing around it, and not be the central focus like it will be for the first 3. But it all depends on how successful that bridge novel is.
I'm very impressed that you have a 4-book plan already laid out. So I think that like it has to succeed. You have like really laid out this groundwork. That's great. I don't have even close to that.
I like what you say about like, you know, like right up into it, you're worried you're gonna get bumped. Like, I don't talk about book deals or anything like that until it's literally like out there, because I'm like, you know, I can hold the book in hand like, okay, so you're not gonna take it back now? This isn't gonna fall, okay, and it's in existence, that's fine.
100% the same way. I've held on to any news about this, and until basically somebody else says the news,
Right?
I'm not going to talk about it, because it now becomes they said it, and now I'm sharing their good news about me or something.
Yeah, I
Like,
wait so
it's-
I can retweet it.
yes,
I wait
if I
for
can
someone else
retweet
to
it,
do it
awesome.
so I can retweet it, so I am not the source of the information.
That's fantastic. So we are getting very close to our time. I'll ask again, does anybody have any questions now that we've really, any questions about his 4-book plan that he has laid out for us? I think that's the best takeaway you can have. Do you have a 4-book plan? I
I've
sure
probably
don't.
written like 7, but no one wants
Well,
it.
okay, never mind. No, I'm just impressed. Like
Well,
I
they're
said.
very self-indulgent. So.
I think if you're good enough, you don't need to plan it out. You can just kind of be good and just be like, oh, you know, I just did this.
No, I don't.
I'm
think
like,
that's
no, it's,
true.
it's like, you know, I used to play basketball, not very well, right? But I had to be the guy who like, okay, I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna hustle, I'm gonna get rebounds, and I can make free throws. Because I'm not good at just like being good. If you're good enough, you just show up in the gym, you're like, yeah, I'm gonna make the shot because, you know, whatever shot I wanna take, I'm gonna make it because I'm awesome. If you're not good, you're like me, you're like, okay, I gotta have a plan. I'm gonna, okay, just rebound, I know how to box out. If I get fouled, make the free throws. This is the stuff I'm practicing because you're not that good. So, you know, it's kind of one of those things. I take that same mindset to writing. Like, I gotta have this organized, be able to present it, or else somebody's gonna be like, thanks but no thanks. So that's my
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. No, we can't handle that much self-deprecation here. We're. Yes.
So I can be a little more vague, so please, this is.
You're in the right place.
We're happy now. Yeah.
Whenever you're writing a crime horror novel or story, do you ever draw any ideas or inspiration from any certain crime stories that you've seen?
Absolutely.
Is that what kicks it off for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think most definitely, and a lot of them are like unsolved mysteries and like forensic files, you know, because it's just like, man, every time I watch it, I turn to my husband like, will you please just not fucking kill me? Like, if you're tired, can we please just get a divorce? Because the number of times it's just like, and it's always this dumb plan too. He had a mistress, and so he built a pool, and he buried his wife under it, and he built it himself, and there was like, it's like, you fucker.
Just divorce.
Yeah. How
Yeah.
much did you spend building the pool? How much life insurance was there?
We have to,
But yeah.
I want to complain about that with someone. Like, what was it? The one that killed his pregnant wife and the 2 little girls.
Oh my God.
Chris Watts.
oh my God.
You could have just left. Like, why did you have to kill them?
What a
okay,
bitch,
we need to talk
right?
about
Like
this
you're
later.
that afraid of confrontation
talk
that you're
about
gonna
that later.
murder those people instead? Oh, sorry. Huh?
It's just supernaturally fucking stupid.
Yeah.
I think that's where we're at.
I
Sorry, I
like
think I really derailed your question.
Yeah, sorry.
I will watch it.
Yeah,
I
they're
will watch
called
it.
family annihilate. Men that do that, or people that do that to their family. In true crime talk, they're called family annihilators. They would annihilate their. And you saw that a lot after the last economic collapse. A lot of people just wiped out their families because of the pressure of losing their jobs and everything in the economy. Sorry if this is a big tangent, but I guess we're talking about crime. So.
No, but it plays into like the crime and horror aspect.
That's horrific.
I think the film The Stepfather. Yeah. And that is based on like an older, even before the current economic crisis. There was a guy, and I can't think of his name, but there was a guy from I want to say like the 50s, and it wasn't even like a major economic crisis. He had just him. He lost his job, and was thinking, my family is going to be so. They're going to have to deal with the shame of their father's a deadbeat. My wife, her husband's a deadbeat. I'll just kill them.
Yeah.
Which is like, oh, yeah, well, I think they'll live with the shame. I think they'll be fine.
Y'all are gonna deal with my shame. Live with my shame, family. I'm not gonna hurt you.
Okay.
That's the key to the whole stepfather series is that they've got to be perfect.
Yes. Everything's got to be perfect. And if I can't control it, then I lose my mind, kill everybody. And then in the Stepfather series, he's trying to restart over and over again to attain that perfection. And anytime somebody fails it, then he starts, the killing starts again. And that's the horror aspect tied to the crime. And again, it goes back to what John said. Mistakes, stupid decisions. True crime is a lot of mistakes, stupid decisions. It all kind of intertwines there. It all kind of dovetails.
Okay. Well, we are out of time, so I appreciate you guys. This has been great. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for helping me fill that time.
And thank you to our sponsors, Tom Deedy, author of Haven and the Clearing, Tenebris Press, an independent publisher of new weird horror from diverse and unsung voices around the world, Bucket of Blood Books and Records, Chicago's premier destination for new and used horror books and movies, Witty Books, an independent bookstore in Tulsa, Oklahoma, specializing in speculative fiction, small press titles, all things spooky. Find them online at wittybooks.com. My Horror Confessional, a horror movie podcast, Nightworms, a horror subscription service, Horror DNA, a horror website, Vic Carey, author of Thorazine Dreams, and Nightfire, publisher of books for the dead, the living, and everyone in between. Nightfire is the new horror imprint from the folks at Tor Books.
Live spooky, die spooky.
Rest in peace, Max.